Hi, Sutapa. Welcome to this journey. Thank you so much. It's quite last 20 years. One of the things that has happened with me is I've tried to reach out to people whom I don't know, and I must have reached out to about 5,000 people on the planet, and I'm lucky that 50, 60 of them responded, and I feel lucky that you responded, and I'm thankful to you to be part of this conversation and co-sensing.
Pleasure. Very curious about what we go through.
So Sutapa, I was very interested in some of your work, and I believe that one of the windows to somebody's work is also through their writing. So I read something that you've written and you put on Medium. I'll just read it out and then we'll just go through. So you wrote a wonderful thing called Space and Intimate Relationship. I was very, very happy that you wrote that. Somebody at your stature and experience is writing something which is so authentic, and at times somebody may see it vulnerable, but I see bold in this. So I'll just read out. It's a small paragraph that you write. I stand today, or rather live, in the intersection of many spaces belonging to none. Am I happy here? Very. There are great days and not so good ones, but a sense of wonder of being alive and the excitement of learning pervades most of what I do. I've learned a lot of people and perspectives, views and beliefs about the world, and its ways that I never knew existed. In the process, I've been startled into realizing how much my own way of thinking has changed. Convictions have given ways to reflections, self-doubt, and a certain openness to changing my mind. I've accepted that the more I learn, the more I'd know how little I know. It is such a wonderful, wonderful thing. I mean, the short paragraph, I think, is a summation of the intersection of where you were and where you are and where you're heading, maybe. Can you expand on this a little bit? How did this come about? And yeah.
So Hemant, one of the things I've realized that, if you think back, a lot of where we are and how we think and everything is shaped by a series of accidents, right? I mean, life itself is probably a series of accidents. And, the fact that we insufficiently account for chance in our lives, and maybe that's the way evolutionarily we are, and that helps us, that things are within our control and we control large parts, helps us move ahead with life and negotiate life. So quite a few things happened, and I would say a lot of it happened by chance, and some of it, I kind of myself may have willed myself in a particular direction, but I would say much of it chance rather than very, very clear thinking, which drove me to where I was. So I, unlike what you shared about me, had a very, what I would call a fun, but very straight-jacketed banker career for 24 years. Passed out of XLRI, got into a bank, made some choices, which were, in retrospect, look fairly trivial choices to me about where I should stay and where I shouldn't, etc., etc. But it was a very clear trajectory. Market cycles were longer then, and, in that sense, fairly successful professional for 24 years across 3 organizations. And even though it was primarily in a bank, was fortunate to set up and start new businesses from scratch. So entrepreneur without that risk, because, you're under the umbrella of big companies. The last one was a very boutique company. So that was the final challenge to myself that, okay, so it was all still very I, me, myself, that, okay, so I've done it in large banks. Can I use my own credibility and build the same business in a smaller boutique firm where people would come because of my credibility? So after and that last stint out of my 24 years was just 4 years. And, after the setting up the business and getting the first set of clients, what should I say? Rightly or wrongly, I kind of believed that I could do this job in my sleep. So it was more like boredom and a sense of every day being pretty much the same. And I'm a fairly high adrenaline kind of person. I'm sort of brain body most of the time is on overdrive. So I kind of figured that I needed to get out. I had no clue, what I would do. But I just knew that I can't. So, and since I was in financial services and particularly in money management, so I did my own financial plan many times over, and I thought, okay, you can't predict everything to a T, but, I could. I'm reasonably safe. So while a lot of people said, you took a very daring step, to me, it was a fairly calculated, calibrated kind of a step that I took, that I would leave a full-time job and figure what I wanted to do. So I had an interest in the development space, didn't know anything about it, didn't know what I could contribute, etc. And that's how the journey began. And then, I had done 24 years. So there was a program in Harvard, which was a transition program, which they very pompously call advanced leadership. And, after a primary leadership career, you're breaking out and getting into something which would be societally useful. So, but it kind of fitted me like a tea, because, a lot of the entire selection process, whether I ultimately got selected or not, was long. And you pretty much needed to sort of almost write down what is important to you and what you would kind of not. Because, when I quit, which was 2013 end, my whole idea was actually to be, so there were obviously 24 years, so it's no big deal that you would get job offers and everything, even from sectors which you were not part of. But to me, I had to sort of tell people that, and almost sort of told somebody that, right now I'm not interested in doing anything with a single-minded focus. That's exactly what I've done for 24 years. So I prefer to be like a butterfly sniffing at things and, just getting some sense of it and then figuring. And, I want to kind of enjoy this journey of also looking. Now, in retrospect, obviously, I'm painting a very rosy picture. But at that point of time, when I was a very much a doer with, this is in 5 years where the business is going to be, and we do what it takes to get there, to being in a state where you're almost going with the flow was not easy. So it was at one level fun, at another level, made me think that, am I doing the right thing? Who am I trying to prove what to? Why have I broken out of this well-trodden path, which has, created some form of identity, which is the identity that I knew, though I knew there were many facets outside of that. And anyway, so, this selection happened and I went, and it was logistically a challenge because my daughter was then 12 years old. So there was all the gender related stuff, right? I mean, what kind of a mother are you? You're going off to the United States and, daughter here. So daughter made me actually take my decision. She said, you can't not, get an admission into a sort of coveted program in Harvard and not, I don't want to hear later that you made this sacrifice for me. So that kind of got me, 12-year-old saying that. So I took this sort of plunge and I went, and in many ways, more than what you study, and that's a good large part of it, was also this whole thing of getting out of your comfort zone completely after 25 years. So I passed out of XLR in 89, and this was 2014 and 2015. So exactly 25 years. To go back to literally being a student, to study. Right? I mean, they give you some amount of infrastructure because everybody in the program is 25. That's the minimum. You need to have between 23 to 25 years of experience, right? So they give you some infrastructure, secretarial help, whatever. But by and large, you are there in academia study, right? And so for that was my first thrust into knowledge, where you're not going to use knowledge necessarily to put it to use, but for me, it was a discovery of the joy of learning. So it was not just the courses that I took, but it was also the people, the environment, even stuff like I'm terrified of cold. And that year was I think in 25 years, the worst cold in Boston. So minus 25 was like par for the course. So it was hilarious that somebody who would not go to Delhi in December was like, anyway, didn't know how to cook, had never done any of that. So that itself was a huge management, buying, cooking, doing all of that, living in a blizzard and, studying. So in many ways, there were 2 or 3 threads which I took with me, which I wanted to kind of explore further. Some of it I did, some of it fell by the wayside. But as I realized later, curiosity and learning, and I took a bunch of subjects there. Today, in what I do, I kind of find that all of it finds place, some directly, some indirectly. And I discovered a subject. So I'm an economics undergrad, and I was very interested. I'd read Kahneman's, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And it, in many ways, and I use these words very carefully, in many ways, it was a life-changing book for me because it's a series of experiments, right? And you have a reasonably strong, confident view about the world and how you think about it and how things actually happen. And this in many ways kind of broke every single one of them to the fact that you start questioning that, okay, so this is the economics I studied and these are the very obvious flaws in that, and how come I didn't see it? And then you step back and say, who's me? I mean, I'm small fry, right? I've not really done anything beyond an undergrad in economics. There are tons and tons of people who on the same paradigms have put theories after theories, have won several Nobel Prizes. And here is a person coming from a completely different discipline. He's a psychologist and he won the Nobel in 2003 with something which in psychology was known all along. So that was the start that, you know, in our thinking, in our lives, in our experiences, we're so siloed that confluences are something we don't quite like. We're uncomfortable with it, right? Because one is we like, you know, tribalism is again evolutionary, very important for us. So we like to belong, we like to associate. And what happened during that time, along with the subject that I was studying, was I got into multiple things. So I came back. You know, I went with a research agenda to IIM Ahmedabad, again, completely by chance. I was sitting on a board, social enterprise board in Ahmedabad. And somebody, you know, I met somebody there who's a teacher for a professor for a very long time. And she said, you know, forget research. Why don't you teach a course on this? So you know, teaching 20-session full credit course to postgrads is a new adventure altogether. And it made me research like mad. But that made me again understand the subject in all its nuances, right? So one is behavioral economics. The other is insights which are practically useful, which is what I was interested in because I've worked all my life. So for me, anything that I was studying, while it was fun to know, there was always a thing, but you know, why should I care? Why should anybody care? What can I do with it? Is there anything useful that I could do? And I found huge implications for not just the corporate world, but for policy, for everything. And in India, it was barely known. So which is what fueled my interest. And so I did this course as a visiting faculty for the postgrad students as an elective for 2 years. But you know, things come with an expiry date. By that time, I'd had my fill. And I started simultaneously doing workshops, but you know, deliberately targeted at the top end. I didn't need to, this was not a job for me, which you know, became quite interesting because you know, in my mind, it was very clear that I left for fairly high paying, well-paid job because I want to do things which I enjoy, right? Till if something unforeseen happens and then I'm forced to work or anything, that's a different matter. But, you know, so that was always there at the back of my mind. So it was never a pressure that I needed to do this many workshops or whatever. For me, it was if I'm studying, it helps me kind of coalesce, synthesize, and get things in a certain format to be able to put it to use. And only if I can communicate that to someone and in a fairly layperson way, which is what I was just a few years ago. I didn't know anything about this subject and I didn't enjoy reading academic papers either. I do that voraciously today, but to again glean something out of that, right? So I speed read and all of that. That was very interesting to me. And, you know, simultaneously I got into, you know, a few boards. Everything is by chance. Somebody recommended me on one. I said, okay, let me see. That was, I missed, you know, there was this women on board legislation, which I think came in 2014. So the next year I was abroad. But when I came back, people were still looking and you know, one of my banker friends recommended me to someone. I got into one company and one led to the other as it does over a period of time. So, you know, much of, what I actually study, I find very unobtrusively in the set of 9 boards that I sit on. I can use it. There, nobody needs to know, though they get to know as you know a person, you get to know what the person does, etc. But it's fascinating to be using that unobtrusively there. To use it very obtrusively in my workshops and my coaching, right? Because there I actually say that this is what I do. I do it very differently. I don't do gender sensitization or any of that. What I do is I talk about how the brain works, how you can bring about change. What are the kind of biases and filters we necessarily have, and they're not bad, but in some circumstances, they lead you astray. And I find that initially, you know, I used to be very kicked by the fact that I didn't necessarily need to tell people to switch off their phones or anything. I would put myself on the edge and say that, you know, either I hold your attention or I don't. So if you don't find anything that I'm saying interesting, feel free to walk out, even if I'm doing a workshop for corporates, because obviously it's not something that people know. And then, you know, I moved on to figuring out that just doing a workshop by itself is not enough unless there are companies which are open-minded enough to put some of them to use. And a lot of this is design thinking and actually interventions. because shouting from the rooftops that I have an open culture is not going to create an open culture, right? You need to actually intervene in how you conduct meetings. It's a lot of very practical examples. It's a lot of what goes by the name of human-centered design, which we will naturally do. And then over a period of time, you do it again and again and again, it becomes a kind of habit. And that's, so, you know, culture comes by doing things in a particular way, by structuring things in a particular way, structuring your brain, how you take decisions in a particular way. So it's fascinating. And a lot of, since all of it is based on empirical research and not leaps of faith, it is science, right? Because you're replicating it again and again. The context is very important. So that's what keeps me, to be honest, intellectually alive and kicking. And because I use that in, you know, in my board meetings, in how I look at a problem. And I know that 8 years ago, I would have looked at it very differently. And today I look at it very differently. And that being a little bit outside of yourself and seeing how you've progressed is somewhere very satisfying, you know, and it keeps you sort of also, you know, happy with yourself and where you've kind of come to. But you also simultaneously know that there is, in so many areas, you know, what I'm saying, I can still do it in a corporate environment. But when it comes, push comes to shove, and it is about, in a stressed situation, which I am currently. So I have both my parents who are fairly old, and, you know, so one is still trying to imbibe and accept the inevitable. It's not easy because that's how we are as human beings. When I want to actually impress upon something, when my daughter was now 19, but, you know, when she was 16, 17, to try and make her understand something, I still found I was back to lecturing, which is the worst thing you should do, right? That's not going to achieve anything, but you still find yourself doing that. So knowledge does not necessarily, or awareness does not necessarily lead you to do, you know, to practice, you know, so to speak, what you preach. You can still do that in relatively impersonal arenas where you are somewhat removed. But when it comes to your own life, I'm not sure how much of it you can put to use. But one of the things you do is somewhere awareness makes you stop and for a minute think. And I think just that pause is a big deal. And I may not have done it well. So I'll stop there.
This is a fantastic tapestry, I would say, that you shaped. Thank you so much, Sutapa. Couple of things were coming up as you were speaking. In fact, let me start with the last one first. I remember once I was watching this, somebody was interviewing Danny Kahneman, and I think the person asked, so Professor, you know, knowing what you know now and being a Nobel laureate, how has it changed your own personal dispositions in life and decisions in life? And his honest and absolutely, you know, the blank answer was nothing. None at all. He says, I still struggle with a lot of my decisions. I try a lot of things, but yeah, so that's one. And I remember I had interviewed this gentleman called Jack Glaser. Jack was the associate dean at Goldman School of Public Policy, Berkeley. And they're doing some fantastic work again, you know, interdisciplinary approaches to public policy. And during the course of the dialogue, I asked him, Jack, knowing what you know now, has it helped? So in fact, he was giving an example of how there were certain very important recruitments going on and how he was finding himself being biased and prejudiced. And yet he would not be able to, you know, so except for the awareness bit of it and knowing the gap between the knowing and the doing, the architecturing of actually the actualizing of the realization was still a bit of, is the spiritual thing, I guess, is the journey, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's this whole thing that, you know, where it, when it comes to a group, you know, introducing change is actually far easier than to an individual. Because there are many aspects of group dynamics, you know, what's called social psychology, which you can use. We all love to do what people like us do. You can use conformity bias to its advantage. There's so many things there, right? And which is why, you know, you'll find Danny Kahneman saying that when it comes to a group, there are many interventions which are great fun, which is why I say organizationally, there is a lot that you can do. And I do the other part, which I call decision coaching, which is the tougher part, where, again, you know, it's still easier for me to advise somebody if that person sees me, I mean, there's a degree of respect for what that person has done, which is why it's very useful that that person doesn't come from the ivory tower. He's not only an academic, but comes from the same world, but has gone. So those bridges are important because that establishes credibility. And then you're actually coming from the outside, and essentially, coaching, I think, is underplayed in the corporate world in a huge way. People do a lot of training days, but not coaching. But look at the sports sector, right? I mean, even an all-time great has to have a coach. Why? Because you will not know your own weaknesses unless somebody who you trust and who has credibility in your eyes tells you that here's where you're going, right? And that works for us in all walks of life. And it's just that, sometimes when you know a lot of this and you look back at how you ran business, how I myself ran businesses, and I use that example because it's also useful to break ice. Otherwise, as the more senior you become, in some senses, you also become somewhere a little megalomaniac, right? I know it, right? Who is so-and-so to tell me? So I use myself and say, I would discard 50-60% of what I did were I to run those businesses today with the wisdom of and knowledge of what I know now. Did it, so somebody actually asked me, I said, yeah, but what you did, you still had a fairly good trajectory. And that's again, which brings me back. I mean, I was in financial services. Much of it was at a time when the market was going up. The cycles were way longer. So it's like, even if you were to use a dartboard and hit a dart, you are largely going to hit in the right place. So as I said, we really insufficiently account for luck. So the downs were smaller, the ups were greater. So even now when I reflect, it was a great career. But I don't think much of it was my own doing. And that, I think, somewhere, the last 8 years of what I study has actually taught me that. If I hadn't done that, I would not be saying so. I would be, full of myself, talking at a panel and saying, I did this, which is something which even today bothers me. So there are a lot of these panel discussions where you get somebody who's sort of reached where that person is, and you have a whole bunch of people who are mid-level careers listening to them as if, you can cull out pearls of wisdom from what that person is saying. But at the end of the day, with exactly the same attributes, the same knowledge, the same everything, the 10 others who failed. So what are you getting out of this person? There's nothing in that. To me, that's absolutely of no use. And, a lot of the leadership talks to me are all fast. I would not have said that 7-8 years ago, but today I can say that with absolutely no qualms, because I don't think it matters one bit. If there is some degree of humility and a person has gone through multiple experiences, I think there is value. To me, my biggest value comes from the fact that I have one foot in academia. I still continue to learn. I still spend at least a day or 2 days in a week just learning, be it through MOOCs, subscriptions, whatever. And I get frustrated when, there's a period of, say, a number of board meetings for 10 days because it comes all sort of clustered at one go. And I've not been able to get to that because that's a release that I kind of need. And, I've been on the board of Oxfam, I've been on the board of social enterprises, I've, sort of on an advisory level been with an impact fund. And today I realize that all of those experiences are extremely useful in making me think how I think. So that paragraph that you mentioned actually came from that, because I saw each of those worlds as very separate worlds. I got into that world, and then I realized that I learned a lot. I learned from my first foray from the corporate world into nonprofit, particularly into a fairly activist organization like Oxfam, that life is not business standard and economic times and what you read there. There is a whole world outside, including the trips that we made to places. So it's a very humbling experience of also what you look up to and what I looked up to earlier, and who, people I admired. So a lot of changes happen, but I also simultaneously realized the narrowness of those worlds, because people liked people who would echo your opinions. And to me, it's the confluence that even from a pure practical problem solving aspect, big problems, small problems, that's where the power is. And we don't realize it because very few people actually have crossed those bridges. I mean, you've done it violently in your life. I've done it much less. But even then, I actually value the fact that I was just lucky enough to have forayed into multiple areas. and study a subject, like I do, which kind of brings it all together.
In fact, as you were speaking, Sutapa, I don't know whether you come across this this paradigm that a lot of people are trying to assert. It's not mainstream yet. It's called Game B. So somewhere in 2012, 13, 14, there were a group of people who descended or assembled at Santa Fe Institute. And Santa Fe is known for its research in complexity science, and they're doing some phenomenal work there.
Yeah. Yeah.
A bunch of people looked at the political, economic, social spectrum. So you have rules, norms, incentives. And they said that the game theoretic construct of these systems will invariably give rise to pyramidal outcomes. So concentration of power and wealth in the hand of few, cognitive elites, and there are a huge number of people who are aspirants, but then, neither are the roots fair nor clarity, because there's too much of challenge in sense making that is challenging. So they tried to actually come up with a charter to come up with game B. So they're saying, rather than doing plan A, plan B, plan C of game A, let's change the game itself. The game needs to be changed. Which is where they're questioning, which is where you get the Piketty versus Pinker camp, where, are we really, whatever we've gained in the since Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, where do we stand now and how do we go from here? Why I bring this in the conversation is sometimes, so suppose if somebody were to ask that, Hemant, if somebody were to look at our conversation right now and ask a question, okay, look at Hemant's behavior right now. Now, what is making Hemant behave the way he's behaving? Now, you could say that the capital B behavior is having elements of small b1, b2, b3, b4, which could be located inside and outside, things that are interacting. And a huge part of this is the incentive systems that are there in these different games. So people are saying that the current incentive systems are actually not letting people, like you came off the corporate treadmill for various reasons, but I would also see it as a moment of awakening in you. But that doesn't come about easily because, one other thing that I could probably cite from spiritual text is nobody knows what shifts consciousness in people. And that shift is very important for a lasting behavior, because from the outside, you may bring some changes, nudges here and there, tiny habits here and there, but continuous basis, there is a fundamental shift that needs to happen. Do you agree with that, or what are your views on something like that? Sorry, I took a long tour on this.
That's interesting. The Santa Fe Institute and what it does in the complexity area is an area of huge interest. I listen to podcasts to some of the people who are involved in that every now and then. But going back to that last bit that you mentioned about, bringing change, incrementally in small ways, whether it's individually or to a system, and the two are quite different. You're absolutely right. See, in many ways, the ability to, both develop some degree of credibility in all of the three worlds. If I were to define my three worlds, and here I'm just talking about the three professional worlds. One is business, one is non-profits. You could even say social enterprises is again a little island by itself, and academia, right? Now, unless you've spent enough time in each, you will not gain credibility amongst those people, because they need to know you and where you come from and what you are to be able to, get a sense of trust and credibility. And the other is at yourself. You will not be able to understand, imbibe anything, right? To be able to. So, which is why, again, if I go back to the corporate world, sending somebody for, say, a 3-month training program, even to an MIT or whatever, I'm not sure how much you are doing, which is really useful, because even forget what you're saying, which is also, internal and spiritual and all of that. I'm here talking about even to create a, say, more innovative mindset. Does it do something? Is it better than nothing? Sure. But is it somebody who would come back to that organization with a thought process, which a decision process, which is different? I doubt it, because it takes time, right? I got converted into this subject over a period of time, reading, going through all of those experiments, and I still learn. And I know how some of the things which I thought was true is still so contextual, and in a very different context, it can actually play out differently. You know, the whole replication crisis is. So what I'm trying to say is sufficient amount of time needs to be spent in any case for those shifts to happen in yourself, for you to question what you believed. If it is short and superficial, it will not, because you will go back to default habits, default ways of thinking, default models in your brain, because they are more deeply wired. So it is time and thinking about something else differently again and again. You know, so a lot of this is actually neuroscience and testable, right? Because the brain today is it's so much easier to, you know, the imaging techniques to see it. And it actually shows that you need time for something else to get wired in, for both to maybe coexist and both to come up when a problem arises, right? But otherwise, it will always be the default pattern. So time is absolutely essential. And, you know, there are really no shortcuts to that. And hence, from a practical standpoint, the question that arises, and that's something that I keep thinking about, that, you know, what then would the advice be to either policymakers? Because we all can't go through the kind of paths that some of us have done, more by luck than by anything else. And I guess the only thing is to get people who've gone through a variety of experiences. So today, at a very practical level, I advise people to say that, you know, if you're taking a marketing professional or an HR professional, why would you look for somebody who's done 25 years in that? Take somebody who's a failed entrepreneur, who's done something else, and also knows that subject, because you will always have a degree of domain experts in that field. Have somebody who has had richness in experience, because that's what helps you think differently. And in today's environment, even more so, you need to think differently. So complexity and what Santa Fe does is amazing, because it's also about the fact that there is no linearity in any of this, right? I mean, everything is linked to 10 others, which is where that whole computational piece comes in. And you need to use large-scale computers to be able to even predict. And even then, the predictions are valid within a context and within that, and not overall. So it takes also at some levels humility to understand that even economics or complexity science will be able to, with some degree of confidence and likelihood, predict something which is all probabilistic, right? So much probability of it being right in a certain context at a certain time. Right. And which is why I guess also large numbers of people, both in the corporate world and otherwise, don't like it, because we all like pat answers. It's either this or this or this. You know, tell me the top 3 things which will get me there. You know, life doesn't work like that, right?
I remember, so there's this organization called edge.org. They've been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
John Brockman. And I remember there's this social psychologist once who was invited for a masterclass. His name is Phil Tetlock.
Yes, I know. I read his books. Super
okay.
forecasting. Yeah, I use it in workshops. Yeah.
Absolutely. So once he was there, so there was this, you know, bunch of scientists and people, and even Danny Kahneman was there because he's part of that particular research. And they were actually talking about the Situation Room when Obama had to take a decision of sending for the strike at the Abbottabad. And he was mentioning that, you know, all the top guys are there in that room, you know, the CIA, the FBI, all the top guys there. And Obama asked them, tell me, what do you think? Is he there? Is he not? So people are giving probabilistic answers, right? 60% and 80%, 90%. And Obama thinks for a while, and after that he says, it's a coin toss, 50%. So, but that is not the right answer, because, you know, obviously, I mean, because each of them are giving probabilistic, and it's not a coin toss. But yeah, I mean, even at the highest chair of the world, you have these things. The good news is they're talking at least probabilities. I mean, I was happy that it's not binary, it's probability. So I'm sure someday we'll get there in some sense. So that is something that came up when you were talking about probability. Given where, and as you said, so 2 things, you know, when I talk to a small network of people that I have, and when I talk to them, most of the time I get laughed at, because whatever I speak, they feel that, you know, this is not relevant in it. So the answers that I get is, oh, this is Western. Oh, this is not culturally, you know, these are not universal. There is replication crisis, and you don't know India as a market and stuff. The question that and I'm sure you would have asked yourself this question several times. given where India is, wherever we are in our political, economic, social spectrum, and given the intensity of complexity itself that is changed now with the tech disruption and all kinds of things happening across the globe, right? From protectionism in political sphere, polarization, and sense making just going for a toss on social media and mainstream media. So much is happening, and we stand here in the cusp. How do you see the multidisciplinary approach evolving in India that informs the key decision making in the political business landscape? What are the guiding? What makes you optimistic, or what do you think are the challenges we need to overcome? If you can weigh in on this, or maybe you can chime in on anything that you can lift from here.
Yeah, so I'm not even sure that I'm qualified to answer that. So I'm not going to sort of venture very deeply into that. But on the educational space itself, if I were to look at the way it has been, and I don't know, with the new education policy, I think parts of it would change. But that whole space is again an area of interest, which I study because there is enormous research going on also how can you better learning, right? From the chunking, there is so much which is going on in the world, in that world. And I'm interested in what, the edtech companies, planned to do, where, one quick way to become successful is just what most people are doing, which is continuing with this whole thing. Okay, you need to get into these areas, whether it's the IITs or wherever, and, the whole tutorials. So, you have each of these companies, so which is much of the same, right? I mean, you're not introducing anything which is remotely innovative. Your delivery mechanism has changed. You're just doing it in a digitized format, and somebody, who spends hours over it will probably gain. But what you spoke of is a much broader question, which is that you start to imbibe this whole multidisciplinary concept in learning from a young age, which, the only country, I don't know, there may be many others, but what I know of is certainly Finland is one of the first countries which introduced it, right? Where you study an issue or you study an event, say a world war, right? And then you break on into all kinds of things. From there, you go on to studying from environment to ecology to weaponry and that is very different than the way we study. Because to me, the reason why, what I spoke about, in economics and psychology, and that continues, right? What is known so well in another discipline is not known in another. And you have prizes and you have people who build theories on top of that when a fundamental tenet is missing. And you will never know that unless you introduce this kind of interdisciplinary thinking in that whole area. So I think that is fundamentally missing in India. I'm not even quite sure, except maybe in certain rarefied groups who understand how important it is and can actually make that change happen. I think I have had a very sort of surface level, superficial read of the NEP, more from mainline paper, so I don't know enough. But it seems to be going in the right direction. I don't know how the implementation of that would be. But I still don't see that whole multidisciplinary format coming in. And I think that format is important at every stage, at education, at businesses, at policy levels. This whole ability to bring people from diverse, if you can't get people who are themselves sort of have had diverse experiences professionally or otherwise, at least get people who come from those fields and get them to speak however difficult it is. Because that's the only way you will, try to get answers to some of these problems. And if you look at anything, any of the problems, we will look at it differently, because of the way from the way wherever we come from. I mean, one oft-repeated example is whether it's obesity, how a doctor looks at it, how a healthcare professional looks at it, how the individual looks at it, how a fitness company looks at it will be different, right? But all of those views will need to come together before you arrive at a solution, right? So that's the oft-quoted example, because obviously people know about the importance of it. But I'm not sure that kind of a convening happens in any, I mean, the area of, for instance, ESG in business is something which is very close to my heart, and I do work on it. And to me, it is about getting those, multiple stakeholders on to one platform to be able to kind of make the discourse a little different from what it earlier was, because there are problems and it is a complex country. But it is because of complexity that you need to get multiple stakeholders together to start talking about it. Rather than keep it to, just experts in their subject matters by themselves will not do anything. They're very useful if they're brought together with other experts of related and sometimes completely unrelated fields, which, can have an impact. So that's the only way I can answer that, but I still don't think I'm qualified to answer that question.
You have, in fact, I think, and I think it also was reflecting in the other article that you wrote on Medium, which was Fear in Times of COVID, where you actually towards the end give out certain guidance in terms of what people could do. And one of that was cognitive diversity scores over higher abilities, and that is where multidisciplinary could fit in that sense. And I believe in terms of, again, I remember having this conversation with Margaret Heffernan, and she's again somebody who's been 5-time CEO, and then she's been writing very bestseller books. In fact, a couple of her books, one was Willful Blindness, which became a Financial Times thing. And then very recently, a year back, she wrote a book called Uncharted, which was, almost the time that COVID outbreak happened, and this book came out. And I remember talking to her where I said that one of the challenges that I feel is that because people do not spend time in going deeper into anything in terms of concept, so then the ability to then have disagreement and dissent and have a reasoned and nuanced argument around it is missing. So then my immediate, the reptilian brain fires up and I'm in a fight, flight, or I exercise my veto or my designation and try to cover up the whole thing. In which case a behavioral, somebody like you could design the meeting. Meeting itself has to be architectured in a certain way where people then have different kinds of who speaks and when, and, pauses and stuff. So that's where I think, some of your work could be very useful, architecturing meeting and conversations. I feel so.
No, absolutely. That you've hit the. See, the other point is also that, if you look at a bigger problem, say a complex societal problem, it is something where you will need, as you rightly said, very deep expertise in certain subjects, right? And the point is, we are each not experts of everything, nor will we ever be. So you will need to believe, an expert in a certain field. And there will be two experts on that same field who will differ. And it is useful to know the differences. I mean, I don't know of anybody except Daniel Kahneman who does what he calls adversarial collaboration, because I think it's one of the, it's phenomenal, right? That I will collaborate with somebody who thinks exactly the opposite of me. So I wish if we could go even some distance, not the route that he's taken, it would actually, create a far better world in terms of a lot of the polarization would by itself disappear. Because I think in every way, otherwise well-intentioned people, by taking very strong stances and even the way you frame what is your conviction, the way you frame it affects how the other person is going to sort of, react and take to it, right? And there's just so much, work which is really science-based, which is in this area of how do you change another, do you say something, if you say something, that person will have his back to the wall and become even more convinced and not come your way.
Backfire
so
effect.
If you really, what you're trying to do is to change, you need to do it very differently. I mean, you go back to Kurt Lewin and the others who've done it and shown time and again that this is what works and this is what doesn't work. But, if you look at any organization, ones which I've worked in, which I sit on the boards of today, you do exactly the opposite. Even in the dynamic that is happening there, you can see it, somebody saying it. Now, I can sort of see it, okay, now we have this ego trip and which will play out. So what's the quickest way to actually resolve this so that we can get into more meatier discussions than just ego? Because two people, you've heard their egos, now they will stay at this. And the conversation for the next 20 minutes will be just, how do you assuage the egos to get on to, so it happens all the time, right? So it's at one level interesting and fascinating that, you see it play out in front of you, so to speak. Yeah. And at another, it's a little frustrating because, that this, I'm also by nature impatient to waste another 20 minutes before we can get on to a more constructive discussion of the problem at hand.
Yeah. In fact, I also want to tie it to what you mentioned earlier in terms of because you straddle the academia, the non-profit, the social sector, and the business sector, and because you're on a continuous learning spree, and that time has to be spent to gain that vivek or wisdom, the steady state of wisdom, to be able to rise above the paradoxes and binaries to choose in the context. I also, this connects well with, the work of Gerd Gigerenzer and Antonio Damasio. Both of them talk about, intuition being actually fossilized intelligence in some sense. Over a period of time, you experiment, you tinker, and then you gain. But if you are reflective on it, then you are honing it in some sense.
Yeah.
And I think this ties into what you said so beautifully.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, again, citing that fear in the times of COVID that you wrote. And I was citing that you mentioned some very beautiful, towards the end, certain updating Bayesian thinking. And towards the end, I think you've written that dissent is valuable and must be made legitimate, which is very important. I'm also sure, now that I've interacted a little bit with you, that you must have also looked at everything that qualifies as an instrument can also be weaponized in some sense. So, when I say dialogues are good, but then some people just use dialogues, the kind of dialogues that happen in mainstream media, I don't gain any insight from any of them. But it is still shown, there is something happening, or even in the highest judiciary or highest constitutional. So dissent is valuable, but then dissent, sometimes people weaponize dissent. So if I don't want to, again, going back to what you said, if my reptilian brain has fired or my tribalism has fired, then just for the heck of opposition, I would dissent. And suppose if we allow for the dissent, then obviously it is legitimized, it has to be heard. So far, so good. But then people are not so nuanced and well-meaning and stuff. And this is the stuff we see even in social media. You have context reading, what they call is context. People pull things out of context and they want to dissent just for the sake of dissenting. I'm sure you've reflected on this, and what are your views on something like this?
See, there are no easy answers to this. I find, actually, to be honest, and I have negligible presence in social media, because sometimes it is not a medium where you can have a very sensible discourse on anything, because everything is bite-sized, right? And anything which is complex or nuanced, you will need to write about it in long form or have a longer discussion with, which is not possible there. That's the arena of pat answers, right? And that's how this whole polarization actually happens, because people come with their specific views. To me, I'm a person who believes that completely opposing views need to find a place, but it needs to happen also in a civilized manner, right? This is not a question, of abusing somebody because that person disagrees with me, right? I forget the name. There is, one of my people from the nonprofit world. There's this museum in Ahmedabad. I think it's called Conflictorium, if I'm not mistaken. And so this lady who was running the museum took us through it, and they said, even first say something like, somebody who is pro the caste system, unless I bring that person in and hear that person's point of view and try to almost inhabit that person's world, how would I know? Just dismissing that out of hand because I don't believe it on any subject. And I deliberately spoke about something which we all think is taboo and is horrible, but there are a set of people. And if you go into rural India, it's still so rife. It opened my eyes the first time I went there, where you sit at completely different places. And this is completely gone in our urban milieu. We have other problems, right? And it has gone because, we work with each other so frequently, that it's not whatever. I mean, there's a whole set of reasons why it has gone. But the reason, why I'm bringing that up is all of this, I lost the thread of my thought. Sorry. Why did I go into that? Yeah, conflictorium. Yeah, so the ability to get somebody in to express a point of view which may be completely politically incorrect is, to me, necessary in a civilized manner with arguments, not rioting in the streets or whatever, but with arguments. You need to be able to hear, understand, and have a discourse, a dialogue. And only then, and there are again techniques. I don't know whether you read this. There's a very interesting book which highlighted, which I may have written about, two speeches of Obama, which happened, and Obama was a sort of a believer in the whole behavioral insights piece. So he had a whole team coaching him. So one was actually in 2015. I was in the US, so I actually saw it on TV there, where I think there was this guy who walked into a church and shot people, right? And he happened to be an Islamic fundamentalist. And he actually used the word terrorist. He even did not use the word Islamic, right? So the entire Republican lobby went into, that we've got a wimp as a president and this and that. And you had the New York Times, etc., saying, wow, we've got a great president. So, you had the, and this guy is a Google scientist. His name will come back to me. He's a writer as well. And he did Google searches after Obama's speech on what happened to what we call hate search. Okay, so kill the, all of that kind. And he found that, and in the speech, Obama said, we should all be tolerant. It was all of the right things, right? And this is why I don't want to, it can happen with anybody, whatever. The hate search got magnified, and he gave the percentages. So I don't want to quote it, I don't want to quote wrong data, but it magnified substantially. Okay, and later, maybe a month later or 2 months later, I don't know when, he gave another speech. And he was obviously, so this gentleman who's writing the book said, I don't know who advised him, but I know in retrospect, because there is a team which advises him. In that speech, he didn't go into any of those, I am telling you so kind of words, that, you must be tolerant and we must be this, none of that. Here, what he spoke about was how he raised questions and he gave facts. He said, so much percentage of Muslim Americans are architects. They've built this. So many of them have represented us in sports. So it was a very nice factual representation of what this community has done for America. Okay, and it kind of ended there, and hence, we must kind of, one word, which you can call lecture-like, or I'm telling you so. And again, the gentleman did this Google search, and the hate searches were significantly down. What it got replaced by is actually checking on what Obama has said. So how many percentage of American sports people are? So it raises a very interesting thing which he spoke about, and which kind of ties into a lot of the stuff which I do relating to change, is that never put a person on the back foot, however, whatever may be their belief systems. Raise questions that make that person reflect and think, because the change, and this we're coming back to individual internal change, that shift only can happen by you and you alone, right? It can happen by people who you trust, but then people who you trust are anyway part of your belief system and your world. So chances of that happening is lower, right? Because you are friends with people who have your same, very few of us are friends with people or will do adversarial collaboration like Danny Kahneman. So if it's from the so-called opposing camp, then it has to be somebody who very nicely raises a set of questions, which may never have been raised in your head. So in neuroscience, there is this thing called essentialism and individuating, right? So if you read Sapolsky and the others. So essentialism is with one broad brush. So all Muslims are this, all blacks are this, all of us Indians either ride elephants or are whatever. And the other is individuate. Does the person eat an orange or an apple? Does the person, So, I mean, each of us ultimately are individuals. We have many facets to it. The moment you raise questions, you have to allow that person to make up her mind and come to terms with that. And that's it's not easy. And God knows how long it will take. But change is never easy, right? So.
Yeah. Wonderfully explained, Sutapa. Sure.
So he actually, and I thought it was a fascinating way, because, what he kept saying is between what we believe and what we say, there is that world in between, because at a particular point in time, what, others are saying, what is politically right, we would tend to say that. Our beliefs may be something else, and it's not necessarily only unconscious beliefs. And Google search is one, because most of the time it's anonymized and you can anonymize your own history of searches, is where the truth comes out. So that book is fascinating because it also talks about a lot of regressive beliefs. He's an American, so he's writing also of, the Democrats believe this as well as Republicans, whether it's related to gender. And it's actually fascinating, and it's not linked to anything he thinks. Some of it comes as a surprise to him because it's just Google search, right? And this is what the person is searching. This is what they're looking for. So a lot of the truth about between what we say and what we do lies in that little nether world. And today technology allows you to glimpse that, anonymously at least, to say that that's the truth. And you may not really admit it openly, but that's still what you think, right?
Fascinating, Sutapa. In fact, towards the last you mentioned Robert Sapolsky. He's again a brilliant thinker.
Yeah.
Doing some phenomenal work.
He's a phenomenal thinker. Have you read his the book on Behave?
No, I'm yet to. But I've heard some of his podcasts. When he's come on the podcast, I've heard some of his views.
Yeah, he teaches that as well, which is a fantastic program. And he's also, a brilliant writer, sense of humor. So it is.
So Sutapa, I just feel like going on and on, honestly, but I'm also mindful of your time. Yeah. Maybe I'll seek some other convenient time from you to have more conversation. So for now, we can just sign off and probably take some time.